speaker Joy Johnson. Joy Johnson is an autistic behavior analyst, clinical director, and educator with experience in clinical practice, supervision, and higher education. Her work examines ethics, social validity, and culturally responsive approaches within applied behavior analysis, informed by clinical experience and lived experience navigating educational and therapeutic systems. Joy has provided services across multiple settings and currently works as a clinical director and owner while teaching graduate-level coursework related to behavior analysis and clinical practice. Her professional focus centers on neurodiversity-affirming care, ethical decision-making, and the deliberate prevention of harm, ensuring autistic individuals are not asked to endure the same ethical failures, erasures, or losses of autonomy that have historically been embedded in therapeutic and educational systems. Her work prioritizes dignity, consent, and long-term quality of life as essential outcomes of ethical practice. Please welcome Joy.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Joy, and before we begin, I want to ground this session in lived experience and tell you a little bit about who I am, not as antidote, but as ethical data. My name is Joy Johnson. I'm a Black autistic woman who grew up in systems that were never designed to understand me, support me, or see me clearly as I was. I was diagnosed at 6. I was nonvocal, but labeled nonverbal until 12. Not because I lacked thoughts, language, or verbal behavior, but because of the way that I communicated did not match what adults expected. I always had a rich external world. Hold on. I just got lost. Yeah. I just got lost here. Oh, why is it?
Oh, that mouse is tricky.
Sorry, the mouse is
It's very touchy.
touchy. Go back to 1
Yeah, come over here.
and move it there.
Yeah. Oops.
Oh, I was right here. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Processing issues I can't do.
It's okay. Is that where you're at?
Oh, it was right under world, up a little bit more. So I probably need to do it so I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, there we go. Okay. Let me get back to where I was. Okay. Okay. How do you go down now? Just push this and go down. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I always had a rich external world, and my communication was present, but it wasn't what people expected. I frequently experienced sensory overload when I tried to communicate this discomfort through scripting, and especially my passionate interest in wardrobe. So I like to watch scripts as my visual stem. So I would communicate a lot of times in an echoic manner, just kind of relaying what my needs were. I also was known as being a naked eloper. So I often would script costume designers before I eloped from a room. And people just thought that I was, engaging in gibberish, but it wasn't gibberish. It was actually real functional communication for me. So the wardrobe production assistance and costume credits would be what I would script at the end of the movies. I was dismissed as non-functional. Adults insisted I watch the actual movie, which is what they would try to make my replacement behavior, because it would make me make friends, right? But watching a movie is not what I like to do. I like to watch credits. So instead of like doing what I want to do. They wanted me to pretend to be somebody I wasn't, which is like sit amongst my peers and laugh at movies, but that wasn't me. So they erased like my interests. They erased like who I was. And so I started not knowing who I was, but I also wasn't being introduced to people as the real me, but as someone else. So I had like a cadence. And so that was also, seemed like not normal for people. And for me, it was me, So as my sensory distress grew and my communication confused and got dismissed, I would become aggressive. For me, that aggression was because my autonomy and my voice was being taken away. And so I felt like verbally, which is why I don't call myself nonverbal, that I would be verbally screaming at you, but you don't hear me. So what's my next step to do if you don't have a voice? If somebody took your voice and they can't hear you screaming, you're going to hit them, right? So I was known as, well, you might not hit them, but I did. I was known as being like aggressive because I felt like I wasn't being listened to. So that was also something that was like robbed from me. So people always expected me to understand them, but nobody made the effort to understand me, which was also another source of like frustration. I was trying so hard to like navigate and live in their worlds, but they didn't do the same or honor my voice in the way that, that I was trying to do the same for them, which also caused a lot of internal conflicts. And as you know, as behavior analysts, we don't look at that, but it's a reality because it's part of who the person is. You have to consider how they feel. That cost of misrepresentation is a cost of not listening is how I was trained. I wasn't supported. I was made to perform. The version of myself that made adults comfortable was what I began to like shape. It wasn't who I was. It was like what made other people comfortable. I overrode my sensory needs. So I would stim when I was happy, like flapping my hands. But that at the time, I'm 49, so I know things have changed a little bit now. But now that was like quiet hands. And I still hear teachers say like quiet hands. My hands don't make noise. But quiet in my hands was also quiet in my happiness, because that was a happy stem for me. So, I just didn't align with like neurotypical expectations. Just trying to make sure I move and get through everything without messing up this slide. Okay, the world didn't know me because I didn't know myself. Improper interventions shaped not just my behavior, it shaped my identity, my safety, my relationships, and my vulnerability. So if you think about it, when you are telling somebody that they have to perform a certain way, but also like doing hand over hand, full physical prompting, you're telling them that they don't have control over their own body. And I began to believe that any adult could I had to comply and tell them what, and do what they wanted me to do. I was placed on certificate track. So because I was nonvocal until I was 12, I was placed on certificate track. I've always had the same thoughts. However, people just didn't recognize that I could have that intellectual ability because I didn't have a vocal voice. I was placed on certificate track not because I lacked intelligence, but because I did not speak the way that they wanted me to speak. Speech became a compliance task, not a communication tool. No one told me delayed did not mean never. No one presumed competency. I had the ability to think, to imagine, to learn, but because I lacked vocal ability and didn't speak the way that they wanted me to, speech became a compliance task, not a communication tool. I already said that. I had the ability to think, imagine, learn, but I also could not vocalize those thoughts, and the systems predetermined my future. So my vulnerability, I felt, was cultivated in that way. That's how I began being shaped to be the person that just did what people told me to do and became small. And I've always felt like I've had dreams and a big personality, but that was shrunken. As I grew older and carried these messages into my adolescence, I remained in a constant state of searching for belonging, for identity, a place where I made sense, for some version of myself that felt right. I made, and in that search, shaped by many years of conditioning, I was introduced to sex work. So I went through all of that, and to me became the most vulnerable version of myself. And now that I look back in retrospect, I'm able to see that that kind of shaped the same type of behaviors that were required for that field. One-to-one reinforcement, just kind of like erasing who you are and being who other people need you to be. And so it kind of I realized over the years it became like the perfect storm. And it wasn't because I was inherently vulnerable. It wasn't because it was because I had been trained to be vulnerable. Pairing taught me that affection was earned. We use that word pairing all the time, and I hate to use it. I try to use therapeutic alliance instead. Reinforcement taught me that my needs depended on someone else's approval. Compliance taught me to say, not to say no, and masking taught me to override my discomfort. Performance taught me to equate attention to connection. Power imbalances felt familiar because I had lived inside of them since childhood. Sex work offered me what looked like belonging because the dynamics mirrored what ABA had already trained me into. Perform well, you'll be rewarded. Do what someone wants, and you'll be accepted. Ignore your body. The task matters more than your boundaries, and your boundaries are optional. Your role is to keep others comfortable, not to, I wasn't born for exploitation, but exploitation found me through the cracks created by the systems that confused obedience and development. Well, obedience with development, shall I say. I'm struggling with this mouth, y'all. So this is not an indictment of every practitioner. So I'm not trying to attack you guys. I'm just trying to tell you how my story got to where we are today and how some of those historical harms are still present. This is an indictment of every model that centers performance over autonomy, compliance over consent, and normalization over dignity. When someone finally saw me, and I was then like 20-something, that shifted for me. So that's how I started becoming who you see today. I met someone who did not see me as a puzzle to solve. My husband, not a clinician, affirmed me in ways that therapy had never took me. He took my love of movie credits and turned it into something to celebrate. My husband is a filmmaker, and when I was a child, I was told, well, people thought that I couldn't read. They weren't really realizing that I was reading the credits when I scripted credits because nobody paid attention to the credits. My husband made credits into learning materials. So when I was 27, I was able to take the GED because he turned all of my learning materials into credits. And now, even though I'm struggling with this one, that's how I read in normal life. I scroll on an iPad. So he turned it into something to celebrate. He recognized that the pacing, structure, and the sensory flow of the credit helped me read and process information more comfortably than the flat text. What others tried to correct, he understood. So this is what I hope that clinicians, do for their children. It took somebody who wasn't in this field to do that for me, but I try to train my clinicians to do that in my clinic now. So it helped me read and process language more comfortably than flat text. What others tried to correct, he understood, he accommodated me, he honored me, he saw me. Through that unconditional acceptance, I began unlearning the harm embedded into me. I learned I didn't have to shrink to survive. I learned I was allowed to breathe. I learned I was not the problem. I learned I was a person who had never been given permission to exist authentically. And this is why this presentation matters. This is why I'm here today. Assent is not non-negotiable. This is why trauma-informed neurodivergent affirming practice is not optional. It is ethical, and ethical care is not optional. My story is not exceptional. It is reflected across autistic adults, testimonies researched, and lived experience. My hope is that by sharing it, we can endure the next generation of autistic children never again have to recover from the support that they received as children. Some autistic adults describe their early experience as preparation for the harmful dynamics they later encountered in parallel, that the parallel is not metaphorical, it's structural. So we move on to the slides in a minute. into the formal content, I want to be clear about something essential. My story is not an outlier. It is data. It reflects patterns of autistic adults across generations that have named it, documented, researched it, and survived it. The harm I experienced was not produced by one person, one provider, or one program. It was produced by systems that value compliance over communication, over performance, over my personhood, and my silence over my sensory truth. And when you look across autistic adult literature, survivor narratives, qualitative studies, memoirs, and communities, testimony and themes repeat the painful consistency. Misinterpretation becomes pathology, distress becomes defiance, compliance becomes identity, masking becomes survival, autonomy becomes optional, vulnerability becomes predictable. My lived experience is simply one example of the structural pattern autistic people have been naming for decades. This is why today's presentation matters, because the cost of forced conformity is not theory, it's lived, it's embodied. It is carried into adolescence, adulthood, relationships, self-worth, safety, sexuality, identity, formation, and the ability to trust one's own internal signals. And when we talk about this cost, we are not just talking about what happened to me. We're talking about what continues to happen to autistic people everywhere. The systems that prioritize obedience over humanity. So this presentation is not about blame, again. It's about understanding, it's about repair. It's about doing better with the knowledge that we have now. And with that grounding, with lived experience framed as ethical and data, with understanding that individual stories reveal collective patterns, we can now step into the core of this talk. So let me go to slide 1. So why is lived experience ethical data? When we evaluate interventions, training methods, or educational policies, autistic lived experiences is not a side note. It is ethical data. The longest running outcomes we have come from autistic adults who carry the impacts of childhood intervention into their adult lives across the autistic community. People describe patterns of harm that research is not only just beginning to catch, but the psychological toll of masking is something that we're just now touching into. The literature for that is like really weak. So I've done some papers and produced some literature, and it's always really hard to find reference points for that because it's really weak, but it is existent. You can dig and you can find it. And on every slide, I put like references to actual peer-reviewed literature. You can read that references the things that we're talking about today. Okay. So, yeah, the ways compliance training undermines bodily autonomy and the long-term mental health side effects is forced normalization. So that's a lot of times what autistic people are charging ABA with still currently, and we're still studying it. My story is only one of these stories, but it's a whole bunch of them out there. Autistic lived experience offer insight through consequences and strategies that may appear neutral or even when beneficial on the surface. When a community consistently reports that certain practices harm them, it becomes ethical. It's imperative to listen to them. So oftentimes when you even think about some of the companies you guys work at, there are no autistic people that work there. And that's always really flooring to me, that how can there be an organization that surrounds the treatment of a certain demographic of people and those people are not present within the organization. So I always tell organizations to take a long look at, even if you have consultants that come in, but it really doesn't make sense that our field, I walk into a room and I'm the only autistic person there sometimes. And I always parallel it to, like, if I walked into a room with the NAACP and I was the only Black person there, it would be really weird, right? And it's the same thing. And I feel that in a lot of rooms all the time. So this is ethical. And dismissing lived experience as antidote minimizes the very people our field claim to support. Recognizing lived experience as evidence brings us closer to ethical, human-centered care. Okay, so one of the most universal experiences autistic people report is a misinterpretation of communication. So that was my main thing too. Autistic communication often includes movement, gestures, scripting, echolalia, and behavior has rich internal language. So I would be inclined to say probably 0 of your clients are nonverbal. As we, as behavior analysts know, everybody has verbal behavior unless they're like catatonic or, so I don't refer to any of my clients as nonverbal. They're either non-speaking or non-vocal because they always have a voice. And by calling them nonverbal, a lot of people dismiss that they have a voice. Even parents, it's unintentional, but a lot of times parents will say, I'm their voice, and I always correct them that they're not their voice. They're just our means to help facilitate their voice, because you say it over time and you become their voice, and you don't want that person not to have a voice. But because it doesn't always resemble neurotypical speech, it's frequently dismissed as non-existent. So again, our speech is not even acknowledged. They're just like, oh, it's not functional. Oh, you know, a lot of times your clients are engaging in echolalia and it means something. It's like tied to something they've seen. It might just be a moment that they remember that you can't pair, but it's never really non-functional. You just don't know. You just can't figure it out. So when I was non-vocal, adults assumed that I meant that I had no language. And in reality, I had a vivid internal world and meaningful ways of expressing myself that simply weren't recognized. This pattern is echoed across non-speaking and minimally speaking autistic communities where communication is often abundant but overlooked because the listener is waiting for a very specific format. Misinterpretation doesn't just lead to misunderstanding, it alters the entire support trajectory. When communication is overlooked, the child learns that their attempts are ineffective. When it is corrected or ignored, the child learns that their natural ways of expressing themselves is unacceptable or not enough. So what resonates with me is I've always felt like in several aspects, being autistic, being a Black woman or a Black child, that I wasn't enough. And I was taught to mask both of those identities actually in ABA. So this disconnect is not an autism problem, it is an interpretation problem. So it's really, some of the challenges that we face are really, you know how you list the challenges and weaknesses in the treatment plan? I view a lot of those challenges as how neurotypical people perceive us is the challenge. It's not really us. So the social validity, again, is something that you want to go back and look at and think about what that would look like to start developing social validity that takes autistic culture in mind. Not just like what the parents want, but what like autistic people have reported. So, sensory distress. So I told you before that I was known as a neckity loper, and that was because my clothes would often be uncomfortable. So I would rip my clothes off and take off because I didn't want to put it back on. Side note, this also was made to seem like I had some type of sexual deviance, but I was just uncomfortable. So you want to always think about the language that you use when you're referring to your clients too. A lot of times, you know, clients will sometimes touch themselves, but it's not necessarily masturbation. Sometimes it's self-stimulatory behavior involving genitalia. And making that difference is all the world in how somebody is viewed in school and how they may be viewed later in courts. Because sometimes your records are subpoenaed in courts, and if they have a history of these things, you know, and it looks like they've been a sexual deviant their whole life, that makes their case stronger. So across autistic communities, sensory pain is one of the most misunderstood experiences. Many autistic adults describe moments in childhood where they are overwhelmed to the point of physical distress, yet adults around them interpreted their reactions as misbehavior, defiance, or intentional disruption. So I've described the ways that my sensory overload shows up, but kind of think about the ways that some of your clients, you know, it might show up that maybe people haven't recognized yet. And I did turn the script in when this happened, but again, I was ignored. And that was also a means of regulating. Like when I used to get upset, I used to script words repeatedly over and over again to kind of regulate and feel better. So as my distress escalated, so think about some of your clients today. As my distress escalated, my body communicated through behavior. So again, I'm communicating, but nobody is listening to me. I feel like I'm screaming to the room, but nobody's listening to me. Because no one responded to my earlier cues, this is when the aggression would occur. So my experience is not unique. Autistic children frequently have their sensory needs pathologized instead of supported, which is another thing. If they need to STEM, they need to STEM. People need to teach autistic people how to accommodate themselves so it becomes normal. I charge BCBAs with the people who can shape the next generation, and you can shape the next laws of like society, social validity. If people start seeing people in public that are stemming and nobody cares, then it becomes normal, right? Behaviors that we treat, you no longer see, so that's why they're not normal, because we're treating them, and we're treating them as if they're like a disease. But in fact, I need to STEM because that regulates me. So if you're telling me stop regulating, you just took away the intervention that I had. And you're actually, which is crazily unethical, charging money to like make me learn something, and I had something that worked. Same thing with eye contact. Most of the time avoidance is because we're overstimulated. But if you make me look at other people, then you're saying that I have to socialize, contingent your social norms, not my own. That's also making me not consider myself and consider other people first. But also, I don't need to look at you to pay attention. Like, I can talk to you as long as I'm responding. So the flip of that is to reframe goals to support advocacy. Hey, I might not be looking at you, but I'm paying attention. That's it. Instead of spending all of those years trying to get them to stare at people, and then you cause social problems, because they didn't have social problems before, but they develop them because you're saying, I want you to socialize how I want you to socialize. So then I don't want to socialize. So we have to think about those things too. So this also creates like fear, confusion, shame for the child. I used to feel really ashamed about who I was, and to include like playing in secret, and that means that nobody really ever knew me because I didn't know myself. So this is what we talk about when we say masking. It's not always just what we're doing to the external world. Internally, we lose who we are too. So the emotional cost of being misunderstood accumulates over time. When a child's communication and sensory experiences are repeatedly misinterpreted, they begin to form beliefs about themselves that are rooted in shame. They learn that their needs are inconvenient, their body is unpredictable, and that their attempts at communication are failures. Autistic adults often describe growing up with a deep sense of wrongness, not because autism is wrong, but because their environment taught them that their natural ways of being was inappropriate. So just imagine if like your very existence is like inappropriate. And for me, like even just reading that, I get kind of emotional because I was told to act neurotypical. I was told to act white, which is impossible on both ends, right? But if you even think about what people code switch, neurotypical people mask too. Like when we're told to like change our voice so we sound like this, like I'm code switching, right? But that's masking. Imagine how exhausting that is. And some of you probably know that because at work you're doing that too. So think about your clients all day, every day are trying to physically be different. And in some cases when they have dual, intersectional identities, they're doing it like me. I'm trying to be white and neurotypical. That ain't gonna work ever. So like you have to think about that. So autistic adults often describe growing up with a deep sense of wrongness. We already hit that. So this just doesn't lead to unmet needs. It leads to internalized messages that shape identity. These messages become a foundation for masking, people-pleasing, and chronic self-doubt, which is a big thing. We never know how we're doing because this is not natural for us. And so we're just trying to make it appear that we're engaging with you in a way, so it's just like, I don't know how I'm performing. And then you pair that with the way that we've been reinforced over time. So we're, the therapy voice, the yay and the real happy, that's not always helpful because I'm expecting that in my everyday life and I'm not getting that. And that's literally what happened to me as an adult. Like I had my first job at Bloomingdale's, and every task I did, I went to her, like my supervisor, and she's like, girl, why you keep coming over here? I wanted that one-to-one reinforcement, but I also wanted that big reinforcement. So when I don't get that, I'm like, and it causes problems at work. In relationships, my husband's always like, what do you want, a cookie? Actually, I do, because I was reinforced with edibles. You know, and I actually want that big jump up and down, too. Like, I want that. And so when you don't get it, you're like, how am I performing? What am I doing? And you're drowning. So yeah, that really shapes your identity, and it also can cause injury, as you know, because not knowing who you are is psychological harm. So compliance-based intervention. Many autistic adults describe compliance-based intervention as one of the most impactful and harmful parts of their childhood. Compliance may look like success in the moment, but it teaches children something dangerous, that their bodies, instincts, and discomfort do not matter. If an adult wants something different, when compliance is prioritized over understanding, autistic children learn to override their own internal signals. They learn to ignore, suppress boundaries. They follow directions even when something feels unsafe. So think about that. Think about you're taught to comply with adults. And even if you think about the literal way that our goals are written sometimes, Joy will comply with adult like directions within 3 seconds. So you're telling me and we're gonna overgeneralize that, y'all know that. So how do you're shaping something that's really dangerous, that's making me feel like you can touch me. When you do hand over hand and I pull away, you still force me to do it. When, like you're pairing with people and it's like predatory almost. Like you're watching me to see, like what I want. So when compliance is prioritized over understanding, autistic children learn to override their internal signals. And this pattern is echoed across autistic narratives. Compliance without consent. So when we talk about consent for our clients, most of the time it's assent because they're not of legal age. So I'm sure everybody in the room knows that word, but when we get to that, that's what we're talking about. Conditions children to disconnect from themselves. It prioritizes adult convenience over child autonomy. And it lays the groundwork for future vulnerability. Compliance is not collaboration. And when it's used as a primary measure of progress, it can create long-term harm. So when performance replaces personhood. So again, we're going back to like the mask and the compliance. When children realize they are praised for performing and corrected for being themselves, they begin to construct a version of themselves that is an identity designed to keep them safe. And for many autistic people, masking and performance start long before they have words to describe what they're doing. Autistic adults often explain that they learned to present a version of themselves that made others comfortable, and they rehearse facial expressions, monitored tone, copied peers, and suppress natural communication. So one of the examples with the emotion being taught, we're taught on those cards all the time that show like facial expressions, and that is even like, I smile when I think I'm supposed to smile because those cards taught me that, and I'm trying to respond to you in a way that I was taught like through pictures, but then I'm also trying to read you in that way. And sometimes when people smile, it's not because they're happy. So if you notice, sometimes autistic people will like laugh when somebody's smiling and they're uncomfortable. It's because we were taught smile means happy. And so we're real rule governed at that. So we're gonna follow those rules, but it's really confusing. So teaching children in a more naturalistic way, even if it's like watching videos and like getting them to read the body language of somebody wholly and not just facial expressions, because facial expressions can also vary with different people, especially with people who have disabilities. Because sometimes there's paralysis, like you have to learn how to read people in a more meaningful way than just those cards. That's not identifying emotions. That is just tacting, So I've learned these patterns myself, of course, believing that being easy or good was the only way to belong. But performance is not identity. It is survival. When a child learns to perform rather than exist, that sense of self becomes fragmented. They lose connection to their interests, their feelings, and their natural way of being. Performance becomes armor, and while it might protect you, it isolates you. So, masking as psychological injury. I've revisited that because it all ties into like the root of what autistic people are reporting now when you see like the ABA is harm hashtag on Instagram. If you follow any of those accounts, you'll see that masking is like one of the #1 things that people talk about. And people have also started a movement of trying to like unmask at this point too, which is also a hard thing. So masking is also described as a coping strategy or a social skill, but autistic adults consistently describe it as something far more costly. Masking is not adaptation, it's survival in unsafe environments. Autistic people mask their authentic communications, sensory needs, or emotional expressions repeatedly, and are repeatedly corrected, dismissed, or punished. Masking develops as a way to reduce harm, avoid conflict, preserve access to care or connection. It's not chosen freely. It's shaped by environmental pressure. So again, we have been shaped into something that we don't know who we are, and it's just like shaping me into what I need to be for you. And we also learn to do that to different people. Like I've had clients that will script certain things that they know that their parents watch because to them they're speaking their parents' language. And so that's how they feel like they're communicating, because it's something that they're like, the parents get excited, and that's the only time they get emotion. Like, hey, they just repeated this line from this show that I watched, and that's their way of communicating with them. So stemming is regulation, not misbehavior. And I hope we all know that by now, but we do have some antiquated clinicians still around. For autistic people, sensory joy is a part of identity. Movement, stemming, scripting, and rhythm-based behaviors are always regulation for us. It's how we express pleasure, we interact with the world, but many autistic adults describe having their joy corrected. So for me, as I described, I used to hand flap. I'm 50, so there was electroshock therapy when I was a kid. So every time I flapped, I got shocked. And so even now, I kind of monitor myself when I'm happy, because I feel like I can't get too happy because I can't do that because it happened for so long. So it's hard to unlearn those things once that damage has been done. I'm 49 years old, and I want to say that was successfully extinguished at like 12. So still 30 years later, over 30 years, I'm still trying to be happy and not monitor myself. So when joy is suppressed, identity is suppressed. Autistic people report losing connection to core parts of themselves. And that is how I feel too. So losing a core part of yourself, you don't get to give that core part to people you love because you don't know it. And it's like, how can I have meaningful relationships with people when I don't even know how to know or love myself? You have to love yourself first before you can love anybody else. That's why neurodivergent affirming care is so important, because you need to affirm who we are and let us know to love ourselves. So because these very things made them feel grounded, like because stemming makes them feel grounded, they're treated as problems. So a lot of your sensory-seeking kids, people, always want to banish them to the resource room when they get sensory. And if you think about it, a lot of times we don't want to go to the resource room. We want to stay. Sometimes we're stemming because we're trying to work through something. So co-regulation is sometimes a better way, because if you think about it, you're removing the kid from the environment, and we're trying to always do least restrictive, right? But you're also doing a punishment procedure because you're taking them away from their peers. So learning to co-regulate with your clients and students and letting them know that I'm here to help you work through this also teaches them how to work through it themselves when you're not around. So yeah, my scripting of movie credits is another example of that, and it was really dismissed as meaningless. And like I said, people also didn't think I could read, which is why I'm certificate track. I didn't get a GED until I was 26, because people didn't think I could read. I can read, I just need movement to read. I have a lot of sensory, like auditory processing issues, but I can get it done, So yeah, that was dismissed and meaningless in one of the ways that made the world make sense to me. And now I'm happy to report my friends will just call me at the end of a movie, and I'll watch the credits with them, and then we go to dinner afterwards, and they tell me about the movie. So that's what they should have been teaching me to do anyway. You want to teach people how to love you for you. So sensory joy is just not optional. It's an essential part of autistic selfhood. And when it's suppressed, the child internalizes that happiness, and that's not acceptable. That's not ethical. So identity erosion across childhood often happens in small, repeated moments. It's something that may seem like insignificant to you, but it's when a child is told to move in a certain way. I think also the quiet hands is another example. I think people need to realize that autistic people see things literal a lot of times, like really black and white. And so I always was like, what do they hear that I can't hear? Like, because my hands are quiet. I don't hear anything, you know? I also thought that I was inside of a bubble, because I was one of those kids that kind of like wandered off and looked into space a lot. And so people would always say I was in my own little bubble. So I want to say until I was like 13, I thought I was in a bubble, but I couldn't see it because it was transparent. But everybody else could see that I was in a bubble. So I was always, what they might have thought was something weird was me trying to pop the bubble. Because when I heard people say that, I would start trying to pop the bubble, and they probably thought I was doing something, you know, like, but you just told me I was in a bubble. so, yeah, small repeated moments where a child is told not to move a certain way and speak a certain way or play a certain way. So please think about that too. Leisure, you can't tell me what, like movie credits is my leisure. Movies might be yours. Ripping paper, I have a client that does that. As long as you clean it up, rip the paper. Matter of fact, take the recyclable stuff and rip it. You know, or it could become an art form later on. You never know, but don't teach people that the way they play is wrong. Because if you think about it, that's the literal meaning of stealing somebody's childhood. If I want to line up cars, you don't know what my internal thoughts are, right? We're not supposed to. I could be making parking lots. You don't know. So you're stifling those children when you teach them how to play. So play goals should be more centered around what the child defines as leisure, and then finding ways to creatively think about how to bring parents and other peers in, you know, but not necessarily trying to make that child do what you guys think is, you know, what the clinician or the family thinks is leisure. So autistic adults describe growing up unsure about who they are because they spent their entire childhood performing to avoid correction. So think about that. That's like living on edge all the time. You know, like, I don't know if this is right. I don't know if this is wrong. Not because autism prevents identity formation, but because external pressures interferes with it. Identity cannot form in environments that demand compliance over authenticity. When a child's natural expression is continually reshaped to fit adult expectations, the result is not growth, it's erasure. Identity grows only when it is seen, supported, and allowed to exist without apology. So that's why, like, you know, the unapologetically autistic or unapologetically whatever you are comes into, you have to give your clients that power and your students that power to have that unapologetically. It's really not possible in a lot of environments for us, because we're always saying we're sorry for stuff that we're doing because we feel like we're just a burden on people. So education and ableism. This is something that's really something that I've recently been thinking about a lot more, because we're not on the same page with educators a lot of times. And I feel like we need to take some of the same classes, and educators do virtually the same thing we do. They're using ABA to teach. So I wish there was bigger collaboration on this. And so a lot of times the things that teachers are doing is, again, not on purpose, but it's because they are not taking the same coursework and don't understand human behavior the same way that we've been taught to understand it. Educational ableism is one of the most deeply rooted and widely reported harms among autistic people. So in my case, I'm standing here as a BCBA. I teach grad school, and even when I say that now, it sounds like I'm lying, because it was always impossible. People unintentionally were ableist, because I feel like a lot of the teachers, a lot of the people that, you know, supported me wanted to ground me in what's realistic. So for them, it's like, Joy, college isn't for you. So my whole life, I thought that college wasn't an option. When I turned 26, I took the GED and I passed. It took my husband like 2 years after that to convince me to go to college, because that had been drilled in me, that college isn't for you. And even then, my undergrad is in fine arts, because I didn't want to risk doing anything academic. And the funny thing is, the fine arts was way harder than, so way harder than that. So autistic adults describe being underestimated, segregated, which again, we're always banished to the resource room, or denied meaningful academic opportunities because their communication, sensory needs, or motor differences lead adults to assume that they lack intellectual potential. I have an adult autistic child that's 31 years old. She is married. She has 3 kids. She lives in Germany. Her husband is also autistic. They both non-speaking. In America, she lives in Germany, but in America, people are always like, how does she have kids? And I'm like, she has a uterus. I'm not understanding the question. You know, like, and it's because I think my blessing in being autistic is I never saw the boundaries for her that other people saw for her. So I never treated her, you know, like any different, because to me, you know, and I actually have neurotypical children too, and they're way harder to raise, you know, so it's like, so it's, you know, it's like I deserved education, and I felt like here, we took her to Germany because here in America, they kept saying she's lower functioning because she's not neurotypical passing. She's the kid that doesn't make eye contact, that's always stimming and looking, but she has a brain of, she has a PhD now, so she has a brain that's full of like thoughts, but people don't see that. They just can't get past the physical presentation of an autistic person that doesn't present themselves physically. So unfortunately, it's weird that I'm talking about this with education, but I think subconsciously, like the implicit bias is like you look at somebody and you kind of assume their intellectual ability based on their physical appearance. So this harms more than just academic progress. It shapes identity again, because we think that we're like lesser than. Let me go to the next one. So systematic ableism creates vulnerability. So it's crucial to name that autistic people are not inherently vulnerable, which I hope everybody, you know, like knows that. It emerges through the way that systems respond to us. When children are repeatedly taught to ignore their discomfort and accept adult authority without question, just do what is said, and prioritize compliance over internal signals, they become disconnected from their own intuition. And intuition, that internal sense of safety, is one of the most important protective factors a child has. So this is just my, you know, experience as an autistic person. I have a hard time reading faces, but there's another type of body energy that I feel. I feel like, I'm sure you guys have had a client that when they meet somebody, they immediately say, no, thank you. I feel like we have a different type of social sense, like it's an energy read almost, you know, and so I might not be able to read your face, but if I get that energy, it's like, I'm good. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just mean, I think sometimes we just know who's for us and who's not for us, you know, and the same thing is like for you, for us. And that's also important too, like treat autistic people like regular people. Like we come in like all kind of forms too, like, so everybody should be able to get it. So it's ethical to name that. So vulnerability emerges through the way that systems respond. And it kind of impacts like internal sense of safety, which I just named, and that's one of the most protective things that they have. So in my own life, I had years of compliance training. So I was in ABA until I was 21. I was in ABA before structured the way that it is now. Like BCBAs were just becoming a thing, I think, by the time I hit like high school maybe. So I got my ABA from like psychologists at University of Chicago. So years I'm in this thing, and I still can't tie my shoe, and that was one of my one of my goals for many years. So I was in it for years, and so I felt like my safety and my vulnerability was all compromised because for years it was drilled in me, you know, like a grooming process almost. So I can see how my own compliance training shaped my early understanding of relationships and boundaries. So if you're an adult and you're what I view as an authoritative figure, like which could be an adult family member or whatever you say goes. And that's not always safe. You know, like children need to know how to speak up when they feel like something isn't right. So I learned to override my instincts because overriding them was the only way I could avoid correction. You know, so again, antecedently, my behavior was like an antecedent intervention. So I wouldn't get corrected, so I wouldn't get reprimanded. So this experience mirrors what many autistic adults report. The lessons learned in childhood: don't say no, don't trust your feeling, don't make people feel uncomfortable, follow them into adolescence and adulthood. When boundary recognition is never nurtured and bodily autonomy is repeated, undermined vulnerability increases. Not because of autism, but because the conditioning imposed on autistic people. Systematic ableism across education, healthcare, behavior-based intervention, this all produces vulnerability by eroding trust in one's own internal signals. Repairing this harm requires us to center autonomy, consent, internal authority as fundamental components of support. So we have to, in order to do restorative justice, we have to label it and understand the harm we've done in order to unpack it. I always tell people neurodivergent affirming care is going to be a work in progress forever, because as humans evolve and change, behavior does. So we're going to always have to need to adapt, and it's not also it's not a one-size thing. We're individuals. So what's neurodiversity affirming might be different for me than it is for somebody else. So that's also what makes it kind of tricky. But we're learning this now, and we will continue to learn it as the rest of, all other areas of medicine and stuff do too. But for some reason, we catch a harder time about our learning curves. So for decades, behavioral and educational systems set goals that centered on making autistic children look less autistic. So we all remember they want to be they want to look like their neurotypical peers. But that should never be the goal. And that's also a reason why a lot of kids don't graduate from ABA, is because if you are comparing us to the neurotypical norms or the assessments that are out there now, those are all based on neurotypical, and then not just neurotypical, cis, heterosexual, so if you're anything in between that, all of those things are being treated. You're not just treating neurodiversity, which, why are you treating that? You're treating somebody's individuality, differences. When do we start doing that? But if you think of the way assessments are designed, they're going to always meet that criteria. So forever need services. So what we need to do is start learning what normal looks like to autistic people. What does a healthy autistic person look like? They're not going to not be stemming. They're not if I have clients that I try to graduate them by the time they're 5, because I think that going to school and doing ABA is too much. But if they can advocate, communicate, do all the things, but they're still STEMmy, okay, they're going to be STEMmy. That's, but if you continue to do the assessments we do, we never going to measure up. And think about that. The bar, we're reaching for bars that we can't reach. So why try, right? So that's why we don't sometimes make progress too, because some of us are smart enough to realize that, have thought that much about, I'm just going to give up. So for decades, that has happened. Still bodies, eye contact, conversational scripts, and facial expression trainings were framed as essential skills. The conversation scripts are really hard because it's I learned that first when I first learned to speak, and it makes me have a hard time following scripts like I am today, because I don't following scripts, because it's I want to talk. I want to be who I am. So none of them inherently support well-being, communication, or autonomy. Autistic adults frequently describe these expectations as attempts to mold them into more familiar, comfortable versions of personhood. But eye contact is not connection, quiet hands is not regulation, behavioral mimicry is not meaningful communications. These goals prioritize adult comfort and social norms over a child's actual needs, preferences, or sensory realities. So I experience the push towards normalcy in ways that echo the experience of thousands of autistic adults who say that compliance was valued more than understanding, and imitation was valued more than authenticity. So we have a lot of imitation goals, and if you think about that, people are being taught to just literally pretend. You're imitating, you're pretending. So forced normalcy teaches children that belonging is conditional, that they may participate, but only if they erase parts of themselves that others find unfamiliar. And think about what that does to society. We're literally making these one-size-fit-all kids that I don't value that either. So when I meet somebody else who's okay with that, because that happens to me, I meet autistic people who have been in these systems so long, and they're okay with that because that was the goal, right? And I've perfected them, and I act like them. Why are you embarrassing our community why are you stemming? And then they don't want to associate with us, because it's it causes problems within the community, because then it's oh, I'm not that type of autistic person. I've learned to be neurotypical. So that's also a very problematic thing that happens within our own community. Sometimes you find that people hold on to the term Asperger's, even though it's not in the DSM anymore, because that gives you more value, not just within our community, but within society. when you think Asperger's, you think like this brilliant person who's a savant, that's socially awkward. And that's not always, the case, but it's like, and then they also don't get the support they need because people are like, oh, they're brilliant. They don't need support. They need support too, So it erases parts of themselves that people find unfamiliar. And this approach doesn't build skills. It builds shame. And shame is far heavier burden than any developmental difference. And that's what I call it, a developmental difference. So people are often afraid about with language in terms of like your treatment plans, about what insurance will and won't accept. So I use difference. I have very neurodivergent affirming language, but I have citations after everything because the peer reviews are BCBAs. So like, come for me if you want, but this is like, like peer reviewed, and it matters though. Like, would y'all think about 20 years from now, your clients that you may think may not ever speak, you never know, because I didn't start speaking until I was 12, Would you want them to approach you like, hey, I got my treatment plan. Can you read your treatment plan in front of them and you don't feel embarrassed or you don't feel like you describe them as lesser than? So I always try to think about that because one day your client may get that treatment plan. One day your client might be a BCBA like you. And if you don't believe that, then are you really buying what you're selling? If you don't believe that your client can one day be your peer. Now, I have shown, do y'all want the aggravated black woman showing up? Because I have done that to people who are still in the field with me now. And I'm able to say, you didn't believe what you were writing about me. And we've been on like ABI boards together. So you have to think about how that, it's like, how could she be here? You never believed I could. So were you just taking my insurance money or, so you got to think about that. So pathologizing interest is another thing that autistic people describe their special interests as lifelines. So obviously, I don't know if y'all figured that out, but for me, autistic people has always been my special interest. And it just turned into my career. So because I was in self-contained classes, I was always around other autistic people. And they did different things than I did. And I wanted to understand why my friend was doing this. I know why I did the things I did, but I wanted to know. So I was always kind of like, so my teacher's reports, it would say Joyce is obsessed with her peers. Like I thought that I was their own primary care physician in the classroom. So it can be good. You take those interests and make them into a career. I don't care what it is. I have a client that likes to shop, and I'm trying to get so she can be a buyer. Be a buyer. Try to think about how you can make that into something that is tangible and they can live off of. But it's a source of joy, comfort, regulation, identity. These interests help us learn to focus, calm our nervous system, and encourage meaningfully with the world. Yet many autistic adults recall their interests being dismissed, redirected, or treated as problems rather than strengths. My own interest in movie credits and scripting was treated to something to extinguish rather than understand. But, so they were saying that would interfere with my social skills. Nobody wants a friend who watches movie credits rather than movies. But I'm married to an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker now. So they were wrong because the right person understood and was like, oh, you like credits? That's weird. But let me make them for you as a gift. And so I get credits instead of flowers. And so you just have to think about how you want that person to know themselves so well, and they're so strong and confident in who they are that they're able to find that one person in the world who is their person that loves them the same way unconditionally that they love themselves. But you cannot do that if you don't love yourself first. So yeah, that was, I always feel like they were so wrong because I won. I've been married 26 years, so I got the social skills thing. And So sometimes special interests are not just like something we like, but it's also like a coping strategy. So when that piece of identity is erased, their coping strategies, something just popped up. I don't know what it is. Something just popped up on the screen. Oh, there it goes. So, well, did I skip something? Okay. I was doing good. Wait. Could you put this back where I was? I'm sorry, y'all. I was moving really carefully. I thought I had the groove.
It's hard to do, so I can't even get it to pull up. Oh, yeah, see, it's
Yeah, it's moving real
How's it
weird.
doing? Were we on that one? Where are we at? We weren't there yet.
Nope. I think we're right after interest.
We got that one, didn't we?
Did we?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we
Okay,
did that.
yeah, so we're on this
Yeah.
one. Okay, sorry about that, y'all. So, yeah, our sensory differences are an essential part of our experiences. If you think about it at our core, like we are just really sensory people. That's how we experience the world. So that's something that you really have to pay attention with. Always work really closely with your OT. I did? Okay. Okay, I did, you're right. I know, I saw that. I did that one too. Learned helplessness. So I know I didn't talk about that. So it's an autistic trait. It's not an autistic trait. It's something that's shaped. Largely, I get on my parents for this, but it's something that's helpful to think about when you're doing parent training, because that starts with the parent. Again, it's not intentional. The parent loves their child, and they don't want them to experience discomfort or pain. So a lot of times, they don't give them the opportunity to communicate because they try to, think about what they want before they get it, and that causes them to never have the opportunity to do things. And I always tell parents, sometimes with growth comes discomfort. We're not going to make them, they're not going to die, they're not going to be in pain, but they have to learn sometimes, if I want this thing, I have to communicate. So that's usually where that comes from, but sometimes I see teachers and clinicians also do it too, because it's like, oh, they're autistic, and this implicit bias that there's this limit. They're autistic, they can't do this. So it's a taught response shaped by systems that repeatedly override our autonomy. Autistic adults consistently describe interventions where choices were predetermined, refusals were reframed as behaviors, and communication was acknowledged when it was only acknowledged when it was aligned with what adults wanted to hear. Over time, a child learns that their actions do not change their environments, so they stop to assert that control. I experienced this personally in childhood, but I want to emphasize that the pattern is widely reported across autistic communities. And again, I think it's unintentional. Some of the things that I'm talking about, I don't think clinicians or parents are going out saying, I want to be ableist, I want to hurt my child. But they're like, I want to protect my child. And so for them, protection looks like speaking for them, instead of giving them the opportunity to speak or doing something for them. Like, why are they still? So I always do this. My parent training looks a lot different. Like, I'll be like, okay, she 9. Did you just let her push you? Like, if she was neurotypical, you wouldn't let her, like, push you for food. Like, no, so you got to let them know, like, think about what you would do. Or if they have other siblings, like, let that other sibling do that. Would you respond that way? Give me the same type of response that you would anybody else. To include, I need to know no, because I know some people don't tell autistic no. But I also need to know when I made you uncomfortable and when something is not okay. I don't make my RBTs in my clinic put the therapy voice on. So I do have some naturally happy people, and if that's how you are, fine. But I want my autistic clients' social skills training to be rich and vast, in the point that you experience different people and are reinforced by different people being ways. That's a different type of generalization, where you don't expect the hand clap and all of that from everybody. But like me, I'm not the jump up and down person. But they know I might reinforce them a different way, so, but the jump up and down therapist will, but I'm not doing that. I'd be like, they know, I'd be like, good job, and they'd be like, okay, I'm not gonna do all of that. So I think that's helpful, because again, you don't want them to think that everybody's supposed to jump up and down and clap for them. So when the children are given the opportunity to influence their own lives, they learn. When they are not given the opportunity to influence their own lives, they learn dependence rather than empowerment. They learn silence rather than advocacy, and this is not a byproduct of autism. Again, this is the byproduct of intervention. So think about how all these things tie back to, like, how we're treating them. We're undoing a lot of things. So going back to what neurodivergent affirming means, it means looking at their behavior, seeing how that works for them, and teaching them how to advocate in a way where they maintain self, and they're not, oh, I have to do this way. And it's always like a sentence. You just got to tell people who you are, and then they know how to love you. You know, so it's not really that big of a deal if you let somebody know, like, hey, this is how I like this, and then keep it moving. It doesn't have to be this big to-do. So yeah, it's a byproduct of compliance over self-determination, and ethical care demands that we teach power, not helplessness. So reinforcement without autonomy. It becomes harmful when it's used on a child rather than with a child. Many autistic adults describe being rewarded for only the behaviors that made them easier for adults to manage. So just think about that in your own relationships, like especially like married relationships. Like as a wife, I'm not easy, but that's one of the reasons that my person loves me. But if you're always easy, you're not even going to enter healthy relationships in that way, because you just learn to bend and shape and flex yourself for that person, and you don't even learn how to receive reciprocal love either. So in advocacy, that's also teaching them how to be loved. You got to tell people what you need, what you don't need, and that's really important for the adolescents, because as they're moving forward into dating, that is what social skills training, looks like. Yeah, making eye contact, speaking on command, rather than behaviors that reflected authentic growth, communication, or regulation. Reinforcement without autonomy teaches children, I am valued when I perform, not when I am myself. In my own childhood, rewards them, I'm not myself in my own childhood. In my own childhood, rewards often came during moments of masking or suppression. This experience is common across autistic communities. When reinforcement is contingent on self-erasure, it shapes the identity in ways that follow people into adulthood. So think about how that's applicable in what I described in being involved in sex work. That grooms like the perfect trafficked child, So, and I can't say that, so this started for me when I was like 19 years old. And I can't say that it was not uncomfortable. It felt normal. It felt like I get, reinforcement. And think about it, even like if you go to like strip clubs, one-to-one reinforcement, that's the way that they're reinforced. Just pleasing is, and I get something out of pleasing. I'm thinking that I have a real connection with you because I just did what you wanted me to do. And it's just like, now that I think about it as an adult, I think that there were a lot of other autistic women that I met in this journey, but I also think that we were kind of the best, I guess you could say, customer service agents, because we don't think stuff is weird, because we're so used to being judged for like our sensory quirks and if you tell us what yours is, it's not gonna be like, oh, that's weird. It's like, oh no, that sounds fine, I'll try that, so you have to think about that. And I'm just constantly wanting somebody's attention. Your attention-seeking clients, it's the perfect job for them, because they just gonna keep getting attention, and they're making money. And then, like in my case, I didn't have a high school diploma because I was certificate tracked. So what other job am I going to have that allows me to live? And I was living in New York at the time. There's nothing I could have done with I don't even think you could work at McDonald's without a high school diploma, so it's frustrating. So yeah, and unfortunately my experience is not unique. Like, I've met other people who have had similar experiences, and so you learn just to be valued when you perform and not when you're yourself. And the rewards come when you mask and the suppression, and you just erase who you are. Let me go to the next page. So pairing and conditional attention. Pairing was originally designed as rapport building, but many autistic adults describe it as something else entirely. Learning that attention is conditional, pairing often taught us that adults were only warm, engaged, or playful when we complied. And when withdrawn or neutral, when we expressed distress, needs, or boundaries, then we weren't valued. Across autistic communities, adults describe this dynamic as emotionally disabling because it resembles unstable attachment patterns. Children learn that connection must be earned and that authenticity risks disapproval. So I live this dynamic as well. But it's not only my story, as I keep saying. I don't want you to think that I'm the only person that's experienced this. It's a lot of people that have experienced this. And when it comes to parenting in particular, I kind of describe it like, can you imagine like a predator in a park watching a child, essentially doing a preference assessment, and they see that they could lure that child with like candy, which also is another reason. Well, I don't use edibles as reinforcement because it can shape disordered eating, but that's another reason, like why that's dangerous. The child leaves the park with the predator. You would never describe the child as like leaving on their own free will, right? They were manipulated. So pairing can be done in a natural way, but the way that I often see it done, the way that it's done to like use what you love to contrive what you say is participation, it's not really participation. I'm not learning how to engage authentically when I'm being fed a microchip of an M&M every time I do something, and I learned being in a neurotypical environment. My teacher one day broke up a cookie in a whole bunch of different pieces and was like feeding it to me like a dog when I was doing stuff. And I remember going to the lunchroom, and my neurotypical peer had that same cookie that was from the lunchroom, and they got to have it for lunch, the whole cookie. And so then that also made me reevaluate why am I getting fed crumbs of a cookie? Why am I different from them? So it was a lot of questions, and you guys never know the questions that's going on in somebody's head who can't say it. But when I tell you it's some stuff in there that's like deep, some of the non-vocal people can write like dissertations if you were able to, like they just can't get it out. So for me, it was like my Bluetooth wouldn't link. My brain and my mouth have a hard time syncing. And so I would like get frustrated. And so sometimes it's just that, but that don't mean you don't have the thoughts. And sometimes the thoughts are so rapid that it's just hard to get out. So sometimes there's a lot of thought. So, so children, again, they learn that it should be earned. Connection should be earned, which it should be reciprocal. Like you should both, it should be a give and take, even in therapeutic relationships. I call pairing in my treatment plans therapeutic alliances. And so that's what I teach my RBTs to do, and I try to get them to get to know each individual RBT as a person. So they have different experiences across different RBTs, and it generalizes their behavior across different personalities. So again, this is replicated across like countless interventions. Like everybody is taught to pair in school. Another reason why you need autistic professors, because they can have this perspective and you can learn from like lived experiences. And we just start chasing connection, and we seem really needy. And you ever notice how like autistic people never really know who their friends are and who they're not? Like the kids could be laughing with them, and just because they're laughing, they think they're friends. Again, that's the emotion cards, and then they laugh back, and it's like, girl, they was just laughing at you, and they, so you never really know like who's your friend. And the chasing the connection thing is like anybody should be a friend. And one more thing, when you say to a group of autistic people, go play with your friend, like, how you know I like them? Just because we all autistic don't mean we friends. Like that, that's like one of the things that like bothers me. I'm like, it's some autistic people I don't like too. We're not all friends just because we all in the same classroom and autistic. We need to learn how to, like, I don't like you, like it's certain, Elon Musk is autistic. I don't think I would be his friend, so. So I just talked about like the preference assessments and how that parallels like the park and the predator. So an ABA is designed to identify motivators, but when it's misused, unintentionally parallel exploitation. So how can you do this? Do it the same way you do yourself. Think about like when you have that treatment plan, that 30-page treatment plan to write, and you don't want to do it, but you got something else you want to do. And it's literally, we're pre-macking ourselves, like, first I gotta do this. That's the same thing you wanna do with your clients, but in a more naturalistic way. Like, not first you do this and then you have this cookie. And also talk to them. Like, I noticed when I was in RBT, and this is when I first started unpacking all of this, people would be like, why are you talking to them normal? Because like people think you gotta talk in like choppy, and later on you'll learn that they appreciated that. When they start communicating and you meet those goals with them because they trust you and they want to work with you, then you'll know that, oh, I appreciated you really talking to me and seeing me as a person. And that goes back to like, my husband was the first person that I felt ever seen me. But if more clinicians and people in our field start seeing autistic people, and like you're in it because you're developing, and I know we're all like burnt out sometimes, but really think about why you're here, because you are our real lifelines. What we learn from you in that everyday billing will determine what happens to us like in the future. And so for me, I'm really upset that why did I not get a high school diploma and I can get 2 master's degrees? You know, like that, it doesn't make, nobody took the time to figure out what my accommodations were uniquely for me. Like, not everybody needs extended test time and stuff. So yeah, that's my little thing about preference assessments and my rant on that. But it's just a chart of what increases compliance. So again, we're not participating. The data that you're looking at is like, how many times did you feed them this thing to comply? It's not like how they independently did it. Testing what they will do for access for something meaningful and using that information to shape behavior for adult goals is something that's like, you know, something meaningful to them. Many autistic adults report that this created a relational template for preferences where tools, others use them rather than expressions of autonomy. I just butchered that whole sentence. This pattern aligns with disturbingly well with tactics used by groomers, traffickers, exploiters, observing what somebody craves emotionally or materially, then offering access when that person performs. So I know people often look at sex workers that have people that traffic them, and they call it Stockholm syndrome, I think. You know, but a lot of times they're just craving attention. And the only reason they stay in those abusive relationships is because they don't have that same type of, you know, attention, and they crave it. And that was also one of the reasons what made me realize when I look back, because I was in a situation with a whole bunch of other women, I think that there were a lot of neurodivergent or people with developmental disabilities that were in the same situation. Oh, okay. You want to? Okay. Okay. You can. Oh, you can. Yeah, you can.
Hello. Oh, wow. Okay. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much. This has been, I do a lot of work with adults, but have worked in pediatric care settings as well, and a lot of this is a lot of light bulbs for me. You mentioned distinguishing between inappropriate sexual behavior versus like genital self-stimulation.
Mm-hmm. How do you know the difference?
How do you know the difference? And then what is better wording to put on my behavior tracking sheets for DSPs?
I use self-stimulatory behavior involving genitalia.
Okay.
I usually, literally, that's an operational definition has to do with the automatic is the function. However, it's not the same as, so think about it. There are going to be some clients that it is masturbation. A lot of times that's in like adolescence, and then that's when you start teaching public versus private behavior. But if the child hasn't had any sexual trauma, so when I was like 3 and 4, I used to touch myself, but it was just because it felt squishy and, think about the sensory, like balls and stuff. I was not trying to achieve an orgasm. If the child is trying, it looks like a duck, it is a duck, they're not trying to, they're just touching something that feels mushy. So for me, that also was internally damaging because I thought that I had a sexual attraction to birds. Because in my treatment plan, it read that every time I watched Sesame Street and Big Bird, it's only because I was excited, because I like the big yellow bird. And so when I was a kid, I thought, and I would hear teachers talk about it too, like, watch her, she masturbates to Sesame Street. But that wasn't what I was doing. I would touch anything that's squishy, and that was like on me, so it was readily available. It's likely that if you gave me the same type of balls they have nowadays, that I just would have did that instead, because I like that squishy feeling. And sometimes it could be they actually like the feeling, but it's not sexual gratification. There's a difference in going through adulthood, you know what it looks like to like masturbate versus you're just like touching something or fondling it, you know, just because it's there, you know. But some children do have sexual trauma, and then that's appropriate maybe, you know. But I try to not put it in the records because the DA calls me for cases in my state for adults that engage in like sexual crimes, but a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding of what social behaviors can be done. You know, like I had a client, my mom told me not to masturbate in the house, so he did it outside. But he wasn't trying to, you know, but then it looked like he had a history of that because when he was a kid, it said in his records. So you kind of building a case, you know, or building a case for us not to have autonomy over ourselves sometimes too.
Okay. So for context, I promise I won't. I'm gonna come find you later because I got 100 more questions. But our program is a short-term stabilization homes for adults with acute behavioral and psychiatric needs. And so often they'll come to us with specific behavioral concerns, and a lot of times their return to their long-term, you know, their forever home is contingent on reductions in certain, you know, problem behaviors or whatever. How do you approach self-stimulation involving genitalia in terms of treatment differently from public masturbation? Because right now what we do is we just teach public versus private, but there may be something with
So with adults, I do that, teach public versus private. Also consent is a big thing. Sex is a sensory session for us. So one thing that I think is important too is to teach that adult that when they start engaging in those things, how to do it safely, meaning you got to get consent and all that, but also how to advocate. Because if you think about it, smells, touch, sex is nothing but that. Oftentimes men and women will both lay down and take it because they want to please the other person. I teach my clients how to, like, I have adult clients that I'm like, explore. See what you like, what you don't like. But then the things that you like, you also have to let your partner know. Because sometimes, like, if you want to put your finger in somebody's ear, like, they need to know that that's your preference and they're okay with that. You know, so both, you need to have conversations and just learning how to advocate. This is an adult venue, but when I was younger, people thought that I was probably a lesbian because I'm tactile defensive. But I'm not. I just have a sensory profile of an autistic person that likes other things, and I'm attracted to men, but I had to learn how to be in a relationship with a man that was okay with the things that I found, aversive. So sometimes it's a matter of questioning your sexuality and your gender because of those things. You know, like sometimes your body parts are unpleasant because you don't like the way they feel and you want to cut them off. So when you're dealing with adults and teenagers, that is a really deep thing, because I've seen people transition and then detransition because they realized that wasn't the problem. The problem was, I just don't like breasts. I just don't like a period. You know, so it's very complicated with adults and sexuality, but it's really important to explore because that's often how they get into trouble. You know, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Someone else had a question? Anyone? I'm going to go back here and I'll come back to you.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome. When you talked about being able to, or struggling with facial expressions and feeling that there is an extra ability to almost read energies as
Not evidence-based.
right, and as an adaptive social skill. And this is going to be a quirky question that I'm relying on your vulnerability that I can ask this, but I found that to be true in the work that we do. So along the lines of like telepathy tapes, do you believe that individuals with autism have an ability to communicate amongst each other?
So
what extras do you believe are there?
Not evidence-based, but I just heard about that. I heard there's a podcast about somebody who's doing.
You must listen.
And my husband is also autistic, and so we talk about that all the time because we feel like that's how we are literally like kindred spirits, you know. And he grew up not being diagnosed. He just got diagnosed 3 years ago, but I always knew, and we would have internal conversations about like social stuff, and then when we get in the car, I would be like, remember I said, and he would, you know, like, so we've been talking about that recently because we feel like that's how we've been married so long, you know, so it's just like.
Have you seen that in your
No,
practice?
I haven't. Oh, yeah, have I seen, do I think?
Amongst, yeah.
I feel like, because people think that I'm this brilliant behavior analyst, but I kind of feel like I have a different type of connection with my clients. So I want to say I kind of do feel like, because I've had clients that later on speak and tell me the things that they know that I heard.
Yeah.
You know, like, I know
Yep.
you heard me, I know, or they'll say it with the AACs. And like, I have a really long waiting list for my clinic, because in Baltimore, I've developed a reputation of doing really well with nonvocal children, but I also have nonvocal RBTs. And so my nonvocal RBTs work really well with the kids too. So, I don't know.
Thank you.
Hi, I hope that I say this right. I'm kind of nervous. Your presentation was so amazing and very eye-opening. We've been sitting here gabbing about it the whole time. But you had talked about, teaching functional communication, teaching kids to communicate in a certain format is kind of suppressing their natural way that they want to communicate, whether it's through scripting or movement or whatever. One of the things that we were talking about, though, was what is the solution when you're trying to teach a child to communicate in a way that's going to generalize to someone who maybe, I know what your scripts are, I know what they mean, but this person has no clue what you're talking about. So what is your solution to that with kids in your clinic, or adults, or whoever?
So the first step is to meet them like where they're at and acknowledge it first so they know that you see them. So I actually have a client that does that right now. And it's so complicated. She finds videos and she knows at what point certain things are said, like at 3 minutes and 48 seconds, but I'm talking about on hundreds of different videos. And she'll pull her iPad out, go to that YouTube video, and respond to you via other videos. So I would hear her like that. We worked on it for like a month. I let her communicate like that, and her parents were like, oh my God, she really is saying stuff. We were talking about something one time, and she went to a clip, and it was like, how can you talk about this at a time like that? Because she was uncomfortable, like, what were you talking about? So it got really complex. So then I started talking to her, like, look, what we're going to do is we're going to say it on that first, and then we're going to say it on the AAC. And so then it was like, let's do it first, and then let's practice. And now we're weaning out the videos, and I'm literally assuming competence, because I'm not sure if she understands, but I'm literally telling her, like, you want to be able to tell people what you want, and it's way harder to do it this way. You're not going to be able to get out the stuff that you want to get out. So when I say building that therapeutic alliance, you got to let them know that you see them, you hear them, and work with them, but start off letting them do that, and then find something that works for them. Because they tried to teach me ASL at first, and I have dyspraxia, so it's confusing to me. Like, it just looks like gang signs, So I'm like, I don't know. And then the problem was I was in Europe, so I knew BSL, and then I came to America, and so you realize it's a whole nother language, So you might as well use the AAC. To me is always my daughter who's nonvocal types. So once they can learn to type, it's amazing.
So it's still okay to teach that alternative communication.
I'm not saying disregard it.
Yes.
I'm saying learn them first through that.
Okay.
So it's like a prerequisite.
Yes.
Learn how to speak their language first, and then teach them how you can, and because then it's like, oh, I respected you. You got to respect me, And then it's like, you know what? I'll do that for you because you tried for me, and you helped me get to these things. And they're able to be reinforced that way, and they see you as like, she just helped me, you know what I'm saying? Like, get to this place. Let me really try for her.
Yeah.
Because they meet therapists throughout their lives that I can name 2 therapists throughout my lives that I know were there for me. The other ones were just there for a check. And when you're that person, and that's when it really feels good to you, because then they look for you later, and they're like, I want to find her. She was amazing,
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was an amazing answer. Amazing presentation. I'm obsessed with you.
Yeah, why don't you get all your social media? Because I know you've got a lot of places people can see the things that you've done.
Joy F. Johnson on Instagram, really basic.
Yes, thank you. I want to echo what everybody said. I have a question, like pre-services. So a few of us are clinical psychologists, so we would be involved in the diagnostics, and we try to be really affirming in our reports, but there's a struggle for that with the way things need to be worded for insurance purposes and getting the services. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, and I'm thinking specifically when you were talking about non-functional language, sometimes that needs to be identified for the services to get covered. So that's just an example. You don't have to talk about that language specifically, but I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Didactics is what you call it. I do didactics at different hospitals in Baltimore, and I talk to psychologists about that. Because I noticed one thing was a lot of them were blanketly saying 40 hours, so that meant the parent expected that and they thought that was best, but also now I have them put local advocates and local autistic people that they can connect with as a first step to getting to know who their child is. But I think explaining to parents that in order to avoid the harm, I know it's kind of messing with your money because you're not going to get us later. But in order for you won't get us later, it's really important to find a BCBA that aligns with autistic ethics. And, I really push that hard because it's like people think that I'm like one person doing this. I'm not. But unfortunately, in the big box companies, it's like you can get the luck of the draw. You could get a really good BCBA, or you can get a BCBA that does like old stuff. So I tell my parents when you meet that BCBA, because if they're leaving to a different state, I can't see them anymore. You have to learn this skill across where you live, because I take TRICARE. So I'm like, ask the company if you could meet with the BCBA and find out how they align with the cultural aspects of what autistic people are saying in qualitative literature. And I think that's something that they started doing too. They started putting references to qualitative literature that they can find this open access, so parents can read that, so they can also remove those harmful expectations. I think that's where psychology can also really help, because sometimes I feel like we're disconnected. Where I live by like Kennedy Krieger, and so I do a lot of collaboration of care with them, which is also turned into like teaching, things. So I say, that's the most helpful thing, is kind of like prime them and let them know. And I think let them know that there is abuse out there. They should know. I let my parents, I'm like, go ham. Look at hashtag ABA is abuse and then come back and talk to me. Because that also is helping me improve too, because I don't know everything. So like you have to address certain things that are unique to certain families too. But that's the only thing that I see with like psychologists, the blanket like 40 hours, and it's kind of like a template, like.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Y'all so quiet.
Okay, I'm sorry, last one, and then I will come find you later. So I've got my own gripes with certain like standardized assessment and curricula, things like that, from having directed a pediatric clinic for a couple years. What are the ones that you used? What sorts of tools have you liked or had challenges with?
You ever use a brief? I like the brief because it measures executive functioning, and it's really like anybody can use that. It's not just like autistic people, I have to use the Vineland. Like it's some things just like them we have to use. But what I do is like my baby BCBAs, I teach them like we use this, but you still have to tease apart what is flagged as like maladaptive in these reports. I'm working with some universities now, and we're trying to develop assessments that are, what does a healthy autistic person look like from qualitative literature, and compare them to that norms. Because like you keep comparing me to your norms, I'm never gonna meet it. So right now we have to tell people to use their clinical judgment and pull out what some of these antiquated, I hate BB maps. Like, it's because people just go through the steps and you become like a robot, and you're just like moving from milestone to milestone real robotically. If you read my treatment plans, like insurance is often like, they don't even know what to do with me because like I don't do any of that. Like, like the normal stuff. Like I try to find like really like meaningful goals, like stuff that translate in real life. And that's because I realize a lot of the stuff, like I told you, today I have on like pointing, I usually wear flip-flops like everywhere. I can't tie my shoe. I spent 20, like not 20 years, but let's just say 15 years trying to learn how to tie my, that was not important. Would have been, so like teasing out those things, like why, once it got to a point where they like, this girl got dyspraxia, she don't know her left from her right, just get her some Vans or something. Like that's an accommodation. I also do not write physically. Like, but if you Google me, I got papers because I could type, but I don't write, but the goal was always for me to write. And they wanted, don't you want the content? So think about those things when you're talking to like teachers and the people you're collaborating with, like what's really important here? Why are we working on like, these goals that don't mean anything,
Yeah, one of my big gripes with the Vineland is that it doesn't seem to account for anything that's not vocal communication.
Mm-hmm.
Do you advise your baby BCBAs to score including AAC, or do they just, do they lose points and you just note that?
Honestly, I just use that as baseline, and then we start developing our own data. So in my treatment plans, I use all of those: gesture, AAC. So-and-so will do this I accept any of the above responses, and then we start at what their baseline is with that. And then we try to develop from there. To be honest, that's just something that we have to do, like in the field. They don't give me a whole lot of information. Because once I sit down and talk to the parent, what their real lives look like, none of the stuff on that thing is impacting why their parents are about to have a mental breakdown in the house. Like, really addressing those, like, all the parents, give me 5 things that'll make your life easier. Because making your life easier will make their lives easier, and y'all will have a better relationship. So that's when you get the parent. And I also am really hard on my parents about ableism. Like, they will tell you, Joy will not accept you. And I hope that that becomes a norm, because if they realize, if other BCBAs realize everybody is saying they don't treat this, it'll stop being treated. Because some people still want their kids to have quiet hands. And I understand it's really hard sometimes when you have different cultures. I have different, like Asian clients have a really hard time with even saying the word like autism in the house. But that's one of my, like, you have to tell your child they're autistic for me to support them. Because that's like me walking around not knowing I'm black. That's crazy. Like, and that was true. Because you have to know who you are to know how to advocate for yourself, to know what you'll encounter, to know what that everyday looks like. So working on the parents is also really important too. Letting the parents know, I know you don't want to hurt your child. I know you love your baby, but this is harmful. And then sending them in the directions to read literature to back you up. But then if they went to your next door, ABA company, and it was like, I'm sorry, we don't do that either, they'll realize, okay, this is wrong,
Yeah, right on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're about out of time. But Joy does plan to be here with us today, so if you need to stop her or hunt her down, as you might be doing. Thank you, Joy, for coming and sharing all of your personal perspective and professional. All right, we are free to move about for our first session.